who are most vulnerable to violence in this society are also most vulnerable to the violence of the state. State violence can take the less visible form of poverty and institutional racism, and it can take the more visible form of police brutality and mass incarceration. If we understand that these things are versions of the same, then we know that prisons and policing are not a solution to anything. They are the enforcement arm of the problem. Think about the role that prisons play in the lives of Black, Indigenous women of color, of queer and trans folks, undocumented women, women experiencing homelessness, women engaged in sex work, which is survival work under capitalism, incarcerated women, 80% of whom are mothers, 68% of whom have a mental illness, or the girls in youth jails, 54% of whom are Black or Latinx, 40% of whom are LGBT. Do cop cars look like safety to these folks? Does the cop at the door sound like support? What does policing mean to the people who loved Breonna Taylor or Tony McDade or Corin Gaines? One of the most common arguments you hear in favor of prisons and policing is, well, what about the rapists? What about domestic violence? How are you going to protect women? So when someone claims that prisons and police protect women, I want you to ask them, which women? What do you think happens to women in prisons and jails? What do you think happens to incarcerated queer and trans people? When someone talks about protecting women, you can tell them more about Layleen Polanco. She was a 27-year-old Afro-Latina trans woman who died during a seizure after the NYPD arrested her for sex work, and guards at Rikers put her in solitary confinement despite knowing she had epilepsy. You can tell them about Brescia Meadows, a 14-year-old Black girl whom the state of Ohio was initially going to try as an adult for killing her sexually abusive father, and who was facing life in prison until activists stepped in. Tell them about Edna Mann Correctional Facility. You should all look this up when you get home. Edna Mann, M-A-H-A-N, in Clinton, New Jersey, a women's prison that is notorious for rampant sexual abuse by staff. Tell them that trans people in prisons are 10 times as likely as cisgender people to be sexually assaulted, and 5 times as likely to be sexually assaulted by staff. Ask sex workers about the constant threat that police pose to them, including the threat of sexual assault and rape. Ask about the domestic violence survivors, mostly Black and brown, who get arrested for fighting back against abuse because of mandatory arrest laws, or the undocumented women who reported domestic abuse and were turned over to ICE, or the exploding number of undocumented single mothers our government is deporting. This system that people insist women need for protection is a massive driver of violence against the most vulnerable women. And this is not incidental. It's not a bug that can be fixed with reforms. If we look back to the first groups of people to name rape and domestic violence as a structural problem in the US, it wasn't the state. Feminists of color and lesbian feminists were the first people to demand support systems for survivors in the 70s, when marital rape wasn't even illegal in any state, when there was no such thing as domestic violence shelters. And these feminists were vehemently opposed to working with the police because they knew the criminal legal system was one of the biggest threats to them as queer women, as women of color, as poor women, and as survivors. Now, half a century later, victim services are required to cooperate with the police to secure state funding. So we have let our imagination get tied to the police too. We have bought into the myth that the only thing that can protect women is the police, that the only solutions for violence are carceral. So we need to learn our history and respect the work of the Black and brown and queer feminists who understood the danger that prisons and police posed to them. They understood that the police were not there to help them, that they were the people the carceral system was designed to keep in check. So what is there for survivors of violence besides prisons and police? If you're a Black trans woman who's been harmed, what is there in the society that's made to support you? Abolitionists want to understand the root causes of violence. If we're serious about addressing harm at the systemic level, then first, we have to move beyond our obsession with revenge against individuals. We need to pour our energy into building better things than the violent structures we are all steeped in. Instead of throwing certain classes of men in prison for causing harm, we should be asking, what in our society makes it likely that men and boys who've been abused will seek out and actually get support so that they don't continue the cycle of abuse? When you take someone who's used violence and put them in a cage for 10 years, have those 10 years of dehumanization made them less likely to use violence, or less likely to buy into toxic power structures, or better equipped to build healthy relationships? What kind of teacher is a prison? What is there about the soul death of constant surveillance and the threat of arrest that could possibly help people raise boys who are emotionally healthy, who are whole and willing to be open and vulnerable? At what point in a young person's education do they learn how to engage in equitable relationships? Not just that they should, but the actual skill set to be able to. Or how to express anger or desire in healthy ways. And are any of these kinds of services, these kinds of programs, given a fraction of the funding that police and prisons get? This society wounds and deadens people in a million mundane ways. We churn out hurt people who then go on to hurt people. Then we pat ourselves on the back for managing to put the poorest of them in cages. We need to start understanding that prisons and policing are obstacles to building caring communities, that they are obstacles to the world we really want. We're trying to paint a watercolor and we are only being given a hammer. And if you think we can pick and choose a la carte and just keep the parts of the system that punish the Amy Coopers and the killer cops, then we are still not getting what the system is really for. Prisons and policing exist to protect the interests of the wealthy and powerful against anyone who might dare to demand a good life. And if we keep legitimizing and relying on this system, thinking, well, this time we can use it to get justice, then we are signing on for the violence and social control that are its actual purpose. Pouring more money and political will into reforming prisons and policing has never liberated anyone. If we want safety and flourishing and not just more harm, if we care about Black women and queer and trans people, we have to have the courage to start at the root of the problem. We need to sever our ties to institutions that kill the most vulnerable people in our communities while claiming to protect them. We have to start building structures that are based in care, not dominance and acquisition and white supremacy. We need transformative justice, universal health care, including mental health services, the environmental justice that Black and Indigenous people are fighting for around the world. We have to put down the hammer and learn to rely on each other. So if you want to join this fight locally and start building the world we all deserve, check out Montclair Beyond Policing. We have posters and flyers over by the tent. There's a sign-up sheet, I think, also. You can find us on Facebook or Instagram at Montclair Beyond Policing. Funds communities, not cops. Thank you.